One, two, three. If you've just joined us, welcome to Scéalta. Scéalta is a program where we aim to educate, but certainly to entertain. My name is Joe Austin. My guest today is a long-time friend of mine, Danny Morrison. Scéalta began it was born during the heyday of the Failure Radio. And the idea was that we would seek out and provide a platform for interesting people, of course, within our community. And they would tell us a wee bit about their lives, about their aspirations, what they do, and their motivation. And as I say, my guest today is Donnie Morrison. Many of you will know him as a former prisoner, a political activist, a leader of the Scéalta, and more recently, I suppose, although he's been at it a long time, as a writer. And it's really as a writer we want to concentrate this interview. This journey with us, which is sponsored by Falsifiers to Hear, will take us about an hour. And we ramble down memory lane, and we ramble down the direction that took Danny to his career as a very, very accomplished writer. So, Danny, welcome to Scéalta.
Welcome, Joe. Go right. I'm all ears.
Okay. I know you are, and I've known you quite a long time, and I'd like to just to kind of to focus the writing end of your life, and I know it's only a very small part. And as I said in that introduction, there are many aspects to Donnie Morrison. We don't have enough time today or any given day to cover them all. So I thought the writing end of it would give people a dimension of you as a person that they might not necessarily readily know. So, first of all, tell us what part of West Belfast are you from?
Well, I was born in number 17, Corby Way. I was actually born in the house. It was a Friday afternoon, 9th of January, 1953. Oh, well, I tell you, my mother, I was due at Christmas and didn't arrive. And it's now 9th of January. Friday afternoon, my mother decided to put on her coat and take my two older sisters, Margaret and Geraldine, down to see my Granny White, who lived in Andersonstown Park. And as she got up to leave, she decided she needed to go to the bathroom. And when she sat on the toilet, my head appeared. And she shouted to the children, or Geraldine, to go across and get Mrs. Healy and Mrs. Stanley. So they came across, and I was born instantly on the bathroom floor. And later on, whenever I was a political activist, especially during the time of retirement, my mother was begging me not to go out, not to leave the house, because her brother had been sentenced to death in the 1940s, Harry White, although it was later reprieved. And we had an argument. She turned around and said to me, you never gave me any pain when you were born. You gave me all the pain later. It was a really, really tough exchange between the two of us. I was very, very close to my mother. So that's where I was born. And then my sister Susan came along, and my mother loved reading. But because she was looking after the kids, she sent me to the library for her. So I used to go to the library. I think it was on Slieve Gallion there. It's now knocked down, a couple of houses built instead. And that's when I would start reading. So I was going there for about the age of 7 or 8, collecting books for her. She always wanted romances. And I would have been into Enid Blyton, Secret Seven, Famous Five, those type of books. And at school, of course, I did well in English language and English literature. So I always wanted to be a writer. I kept diaries in the 60s. I was involved in Radio Free Belfast. I had built the first transmitter.
Just explain, if you don't mind, Danny, because these are things old men like us have already understanding of. So when you say you were involved in Radio Free Belfast, what does that mean?
Well, when the programs took place on Thursday, the 14th of August, 1969, and then the next day, of course, Clonard and Bombay Street was burnt down. Barricades were put up in many nationalist areas, and where I lived, of course, on the Falls Road. I and a couple of other people, maybe 12 or 14 of us, had been involved in a little illegal community. We built our own transmitters. pirate radio stations, and we would come on the air after midnight. When Radio Ulster went off the air, we would use its frequency. So there's people from the Shankill Road, Sandy Road, some from Lisburn, but 12 or 14 of us. So the Republican movement had heard that I had a transmitter. When the barricades went up, they asked me would I put it into the long bar, above the long bar in Leeson Street, which is no longer there now. But the long bar was owned by a man called Paddy Lenihan. And as a student, 15, 16 years of age, I'd worked in various bars, including with Paddy Lenihan in the Slamish rooms down in Smithfield. And Paddy Lenihan's daughter, of course, became the President of Ireland, Mary McAleese. So I put my transmitter in there. And I remember one night the Irish News came in to take a photograph. And everybody, no, nobody wanted a photograph taken. Of course, cheeky me, I had my photograph taken from the back, of course, so I was security conscious even at the age of 16. And that was published in the Irish News. I still have that photograph. So I suppose that's an indication that I was interested in communication from an early age. I had always wanted to be a writer, but I didn't have the courage, of course, to declare that to anyone. I wrote it secretly in my diary. And I was also, believe it or not, a member of the Legion of Mary back then. I was quite a devout Catholic. And I used to stay in the Morningstar Hostel in Divis Street at the weekends. I worked in the Waitford Inn. I would finish work there at 10:30 at night, and then I would go down and stay in the Morningstar Hostel and make the elderly men and the indigents and alcoholics their breakfast and their dinner on a Sunday. And I fell in with this old, very, very bitter man called Neil McCartney. And Neil McCartney drank methylated spirits, and he drank it by mixing it with milk. Exactly, his eyes were turning methylated blue. The whites of his eyes were turning methylated blue. But I became very friendly with him. He used to sit in the Falls Library, and I would have get into the Falls Library to get books and also to study, to sit at the tables to study because there was no room at home. And he and I had long conversations. And he turned around and said to me, and this is in my diary, in September 1970, he says, "You're going to be a writer." And I wrote that into my diary. Neil then, he couldn't get, none of the shops, none of the hardware shops in the Falls Road would sell methylated spirits. So he had this circuitous route around the city, how to get this methylated spirits. We had to search them. We weren't allowed to bring drink into the Morningstar Hostel. But Neil took a stroke, and he was in a nursing home out by White Abbey, so I went out to see him. And he was in a wheelchair, and he could hardly talk, but he still had that mischievous smile. And we just sat there talking, overlooking Belfast Lough. But I later learned that during the Second World War, Neil had been a train driver in London. And during the Blitz, he came home one day, and his house had been hit by a bomb, Luftwaffe bomb, and his wife and 3 kids were killed. And that was the beginning of his slow descent into alcoholism. So whenever I was then studying after 70, 71, I was studying A-level English literature and history. I'd moved to the College of Business Studies, but then internment came in, and I started to write for volunteer. Each local area had their own little newspaper, Scéalta Press, you call it, or printed on an old Gestetner printing machine, most of which were cannibalized from the local schools, including the paper and the ink. So I wrote for it, and then my friends were, I knew Joe Clark, who was a hooded man, who was beaten up. I remember Bernard Fox being arrested. The internment week itself was horrific. We were fighting the Brits on the Falls Road, and the Brits opened fire, took a lump out of the wall behind my head at the Ivy Drive entry. So it was horrific, and I had this conflict in myself. Here's to me going to the College of Business Studies as if everything was fine, and internment's been introduced. And it got to a point where I thought I had to make a choice, and I decided that was it. I was devoting my life to public struggle, Republican movement, and I was then arrested several times, Springfield Road Barracks, beaten up Springfield Road Barracks, and brought to Paisley Park, where there's a British Army base, thrown out onto the West Circular Road during a gun battle.
Which
And
is a loyalist area.
Royalist area. All sorts of stuff like this. My friend Noel Maguire, who later became a Sinn Féin councillor in Antrim, he was picked up and brought to Gerwood Barracks, and they cut his hair off with a dagger. And all these stories coming out of brutality in the interrogation centres. So it was actually quite terrifying to consciously decide to become part of this struggle and to take these risks.
Can I just stop you just for a second? Because I'm trying to get a flavour of all of you, as opposed to this obviously crucial part of your life. And you're outlining there your childhood, your adventures in the library, your Morning Star activity. What you didn't mention really in any detail were the friends you had made at this age. How did they view this young lad in their midst who was more interested perhaps in a book than he was in being a young person, or who spent time in a library as he did on a football pitch? How were you seen by those you were growing up with?
I don't know. I was certainly. I mean, my nickname when I was young was Smiler, but I was quite modest, and believe it or not, and I think that I matured as a result of the conflict, and I also remember. I remember Canon Montague trying to reintroduce the RUC after 1969, and I was put up for a debate in St Paul's Youth Club in Cavendish Square with actually a Catholic member of the RUC. I think his name was Leo McBreen. He was a detective in the RUC. It may have been based in Springfield Road Barracks, and I had a debate with him. That would have been June, July 1970, just before the curfew. So I was starting to come out of my shell, so to speak, and had lots of arguments at home. I mean, my father was a pacifist, a very religious man, but not necessarily a nice. I think his nationalism came as a result of me and my brother Kieran, who also went to jail. But my father, I remember when I was interned. I'm going to jump a little bit forward here. I was interned in 1972, and I remember my father coming up to visit me, and we were in Nissan huts. I was in cage 5 and then in cage 2. And he said to me, "Are the huts still cold in there?" I says, "Why?" I says, "Were you interned?" He says, "No, I did my RAF induction here in Longcash in 1944, 45, because it had been an RAF aerodrome."
Yeah.
And I said, "You were in the RAF?" He says, "No." He says, "I knew the war was coming in the end." So it wasn't the great chances. He says, "I was one of the Brill Cream boys." They put Brill Cream on their hair and probably thought they were gorgeous to all the young ladies at that time. So that would have been his. And my grandfather, my Danny Morrison, he joined. He fought in the First World War. He was attached to the Royal Flying Corps. Later became the RAF. He also, for a time, as younger brother, his 11-year-old brother was knocked down and killed by the British Army in Castle Street in 1921. He himself, after he was demobilised from the British Army, he was arrested along with 20 other people in rooms in Slate Street or somewhere down the Falls, and he was charged with IRA membership. And of course, they didn't have solicitors to represent him. He says, "How can I be in the IRA?" He says, "I'm only out of the Royal Air Force." So he was acquitted. He then went south and joined the Free State Army, and he was a boxer. And he was supposed to take a dive in a fight, and he wouldn't take the dive. He knocked his opponent out, he went AWOL from the Free State Army, came back to Belfast. But whenever war broke out in 1939, my granddad Jimmy Morrison, who was from Springview Street, originally Mazarine Street in Maloney, he rejoined, and he was in Malta during the Luftwaffe bombardment of Malta. And in fact, the Maltese people were awarded, I think it was the Victoria, the George Cross
Yeah,
for
Victoria
that
Cross.
part,
Yeah.
Victoria Cross. So you had on that was my father's side. I would say pro-British, and then on my mother's side, a family of musicians, traditional musicians, certainly nationalism, uh, Gaelic speakers, GAA players, and of course, my uncle Harry being the most prominent one, who was a senior IRA man, once the chief of staff in the 1940s. And his older sister, my Auntie May, her husband, Hugh Downey, who was from Dromore in County Down, he had actually been in the IRA at the time of partition. And he defended St. Coleman's Chapel in Dromore against the sectarian attack, him and several other IRA men. But later on, he became a member of the Republican Labour, and he was elected to Stormont for your part of the world, for the Docks Ward in
Yeah, yeah.
1945 to 49 or 1950. And he lost the seat because Sam McCautry, who was about 20 years of age, stood against him and split the Republican, split the Labour vote.
Yeah.
So I had an uncle,
Northern
at
Ireland Labour.
Stormont, an uncle at Stormont, and an uncle in the IRA. That's
Well,
where the
with
army
that pedigree, Danny, you were either going to be a writer or something that was extraordinary. Let me just stop you for 1 second. I want to, for those who have just joined us, just to tell them who we are and what we're at. My name is Joe Austin. I'm interviewing Danny Morrison. This is Scéalta, and we are a program who aims to, as I said at the intro, to educate and entertain, and it's to help you wind away those hours of isolation. So Danny Morrison is my guest, and we kind of came from a young boy to, before I interrupt you and waylaid you were talking about being interned. So what I want to do is I want to ask you, you've given the background of your father and grandfather, and I'm trying to kind of to examine the story that life is the greatest source of material for a writer. So you're interned. In internment, did you develop those skills or the aspiration of writing?
Well, I had also written uh, some death notices for Republican News in 1972, particularly after the death of a young man who was very close to me, 18-year-old Jimmy Quigley, who had been shot dead on the 29th of September 1972 by the British Army in Albert Street. And then later Stan Carberry, who was shot dead unarmed by the Royal Green Jackets at the top of La Salle Drive in November 1972. And in fact, on the day of Stan's funeral that night, the British Army surrounded Beachmount, and I was among a number of people who were arrested. Although I got out of Castlereagh, but only for a short period. The following Sunday, I was arrested at a dance in Clonard Hall. They surrounded the hall and came in firing rubber bullets. I think they arrested about 70 teenagers that night and brought us to separate barracks. So I ended up interned along with Paul Fox, who Paul had been in the car with Stan Carberry the week before when Stan was shot dead.
Just let me stop you because I'm going to periodically explain to those who perhaps wouldn't know it. You were interned without trial. You were arrested, not tried, and put in prison.
Yes. In fact, interestingly, while I was in Castlereagh, the British government, because Long Kesh had been a byword for torture and brutality around the world, the British government, as it did incidentally with Windscale, I mean, again, you would know this, but other people may not. Windscale is a nuclear power station pumping nuclear waste into the Irish Sea, about 30 miles from Dundalk, and it had been condemned. So what the British government did was they changed its name to Sellafield and put out a statement saying that they'd closed Windscale. So similarly, Long Kesh, when I was in Castlereagh, a screw got up, prison officer, unscrewed the name Long Kesh, and put up Maze Prison. At the same time, the British government issued a statement through its embassies around the world saying that it had closed down Long Kesh and it had ceased to intern anyone. But what happened was that they went into the internees and they said, "You're no longer interned, you're now detained." No difference. And that's how they got away. That's how they got away. That's what they did.
Makes a
That's
big
how
difference.
long that. But this day, for example, we wouldn't refer to it as the maze. Loyalists would, prison officers would, the British would, the media would. Just the H blocks were the H blocks of Long Kesh. That was built on the same land, but behind a wall. So you've all these residents. And this is, as a publicist, you have to fight every argument over terminology. It's extremely important. You never relinquish and use their terminology.
Okay. You're interned, you're in confinement, you're obviously, or detained, depending what is the polite reference. So were you hungry for reading? Were you hungry for that development? Was it an extension of the days you sat, maybe wet days you sat in the library? Did you use that time to develop your skills?
There was no library in the cages of Long Kesh. It was a pretty rough prison. There was maybe 60 of us each hut. On one occasion, when it was overcrowding, there was two people. Mickey Bradley from Beachmont was in the middle bunk, and on the top bunk was John Stone from Ballymurphy, who was later killed in action in 1975. There was rats in the hut, loads of mice in the hut. The doors, the wind just blew from one end to the other. It was a really, really cold prison, but the camaraderie was incredible. So whilst there, I then decided to sit my A-level English, and I studied for A-level English, and I also started to write some short stories. And interestingly, a man from Dungiven had just been interned about 3 months after me, and he was a school teacher. So I asked him would he read some of my short stories, and he came over because you were allowed. You could, if you claimed that your brother or cousin was in another cage, there was maybe 5 visits allowed to a cage. So he came over, and Francie Brawley was the person, and so Francie advised me about my writing. Of course, Francie, who died only 3 months ago, was also wrote the famous The H Block song. Brilliant song.
What was there a particular etiquette within that prison community that for instance that you read patriotic books, or you read patriotic periodicals, or could you read what you wanted to read, or did you try and expand the area of your reading?
Well, there was Irish language classes, there was political discussions, there was Sinn Féin coming. I became the PRO, the Sinn Féin coming in Cage 2. And there was all sorts of books about the Mexican Revolution, the Russian Revolution, struggle in Africa, Vietnam, you must understand, still hadn't been resolved at that stage. Nelson Mandela, of course, was entering his 8th, 9th year in jail, out of a total of 26. So there was no doubt there was a consciousness that you were political, radical, revolutionary. Now, there were some older men there, of course, who had been interned in the 50s, and some of them had even been interned in the 40s. And some of the people, when they had been interned in the 40s, they had been interned with people who had been interned in the 20s. So there was this whole prison experience of how to smuggle, how to escape, how to seduce prison officers and reduce their security and all this. It was a fantastic experience. Now, of course, we were subjected to very brutal British military searches. We were surrounded by British Army sentry posts who had the permission to open fire if anybody tried to get across the wire. But once every 3 to 4 weeks, they would come into the cage, 3 o'clock in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning with Alsatians, drag you out of bed, put you up against the fence. They'd be looking for bolt cutters. They'd be looking for cameras. They'd be but I remember at Christmas, one Christmas, when we had got our parcels in, one of these raids took place, and they poured petrol into our water tank, the Burco boiler, which serviced the cage, and they put sugar on meat products that their family had sent in because prison food was horrible. We relied on our families, but the only thing they didn't touch was a Christmas cake for Joe Russell. So when we get back in again, they stole photographs of your girlfriends, ripping up your letters. The cake, Joe's cake, was the only thing that was there. So we decided to have Joe's cake, and one of the lads was just about to put the cake in his mouth, and another man grabbed him. They had inserted razor blades into the cake, which of course would have destroyed your mouth, you know. So that's the type of thing that that we went through, and of course I was there when Brendan Hughes escaped. I was there when Tony Coogan escaped. I wasn't there during the fire whenever Hugh Coney, who I knew, Hugh Coney was from Coal Island, and he used to come across, and the prisoner in the next bed to me was John Davey from South Derry. And John, of course, was later assassinated. I mean, if you were to count the people in the prison, what happened to them, I mean, it's extraordinary, you know, where everybody, what they went through.
That's the point that I'm trying to bring you to. So that life, which has to be, as you say, a treasure trove for a budding writer, for the imagination of a writer. That kind of experience, that I'm not suggesting this is a good enough reason to be in jail, but you certainly wouldn't, a young writer or any writer would have seen the stories coming left, right, and centre, and the kind of the main would have developed. Did that fire your enthusiasm? I know you say that, and of course you did. You read political novels and political kind of stories about other struggles and all that. But did you broaden out? Were you able to? I know there's a limited number of books. Were you able to expand your literary opportunities?
Well, I passed A-level English, but I was released. There was about 60 of us released to appease the SDLP, actually, because the Northern Ireland Executive, the Power Sharing Executive, had been set up under Brian Faulkner, who had introduced internment. So the SDLP were saying we need some concessions here. So about 60 of us released, and amongst them were myself, Joe McDonald, who's later Dan Hungerstrike, Hugh O'Neill from Beachmount, who later died in tragic circumstances in England, Harry Burns, who was quite a well-known Republican in West Belfast and further afield. So I came out, and I got about 2 weeks of freedom. Somebody had been in Castlereagh and said the cops had mentioned your name, so I immediately left the house. I was now 21 years of age and planned to get married. So I immediately left the house, and about a week later, they hit the house. So from then on, I was moving around from house to house, using false ID, false like a student identity card, or different. I went through about 3 or 4 different identities, and it wasn't until the 1975 ceasefire when I'd met Tom Hartley, who was chair of the Republican Press Centre before that. Met him a few years before that, but I was invited in to help monitor the ceasefire by Prentice McGart at 170 Falls Road, and I did duty there. So the arrangement was, if the Brits suspected the IRA had been moving weapons around, they would phone there to complain, and if the British Army were on the streets and in particular areas or were carrying out actions in breach of the ceasefire, we would have phoned with the contact with the Northern Ireland office. But it was a bit of that ceasefire in 1975 was disastrous. I think the Republican movements in some aspects lost its way. Towards the end of 1975, there was a disastrous feud with the Sticks, the official IRA, which left 11 people dead in Belfast, and it's 30, 40 wounded, and 60, 70 people going to jail. And at the same time, although it had never been declared that the ceasefire was ending, I mean, South Armagh was operating again from about August 1975 onwards, and it was a very confusing period for. I remember Sean McDermott and I turned around and said, I mean, we've been told that the British Army and the British government are withdrawn, and where's the sign of it? What some Republican leaders were quoting to us was that, well, Rolls-Royce has pulled out of East Belfast. That's the economic withdrawal before the political withdrawal. But in actual fact, the British government was preparing for the next stage. They were ending internment on this side of the wall and building the H blocks on the other side of the wall. So there was a 12-week period from the last internee got out around the 20th of December 1975, and on the 1st of March 1976, the Brits launched their next phase, which was criminalisation, Ulsterisation, because dead British soldiers were creating troops out sentiment in England, so they decided to put more IUC, more UDR, Ulster Defence Regiment soldiers in the front line, reduce the number of British soldiers, and then they were able to depict the killings of the UDR and IUC as sectarian. Oh, look, it's the Catholics killing the Protestants. And that was the next phase of what the British Army were engaged in. Having said that, in the middle of 1975, while I was based at the Republican Press Centre, the editor of Republican News resigned, and I was asked, could I edit the paper? And of course, being a cheeky yet, I said, absolutely, that wouldn't be a problem to me at all. So I ended up becoming the editor. I was 22 years of age of Republican News, and that was another huge challenge, but leading to a fairly exciting time where we modernised the paper, got new writers in, had our own photographers, put it up to the British government in terms of war news, what we were prepared to publish, exclusive interviews we had with people, and of course that eventually led to an attempt to close down Republican News in 1977 and 78, with the staff being arrested and going to jail, and myself being arrested and charged with IRA membership and held on remand in Crumlin Road Jail. Can I just say something, Joe? Just for you, Joe, I just noticed my phone is down to 23%. I'm going to need to put a charger on it. Shall I go and get a charger? Yeah.
If you can go and get it now, handy. Yeah, put it on. Yeah,
it's a mobile charger. It might alter.
I put it on.
A little, but it's better go and get it before it dies. Okay, 2 minutes.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Good one. While we've got this short break, can I just remind you that this is Scéalta. My name is Joe Austin, and I'm interviewing Danny Morrison. The purpose of the program is to wind away those hours or days or perhaps weeks now of isolation. We aim to entertain and educate. And the idea, of course, is that we bring to you, from within this community and wider afield, people who have an interesting story, an interesting life, people who have perhaps had a journey that's outside the norm, and they're able to make us. So Danny has rejoined us. I think we have resolved our technical problem. We have resolved it. You're okay now?
Well, I'm hoping that I'm hoping that does the trick.
Well, look, let's pursue it until we have to finish, or we've run out of time. I want to take you. I keep jumping you back and forward, and I apologise for that. But what I was saying there before we had that short break was that all of these experiences, these life experiences, some not that pleasant, most not that pleasant, so far as you're interned without trial or you're in conditions that are less than comfortable. Were they building this chest, this writer's chest? Were they creating this material that a later Danny Morrison would begin to turn into one of your many stories?
Well, I think actually, as I said to you, from I was very young, I had this secret idea that I'd love to be a writer. I never actually did. Never, I think what happened was that the conflict came along, the struggle came along, and I devoted whatever supposed talent for communicating that I had into the struggle. So I became, first of all, PRO in Long Cash. Then I became editor of Republican News. Then I became editor of Infoblock Republican News and the National Director of Publicity for Sinn Féin. And that lasted for 11 years until I was arrested on kidnapping and conspiracy to murder charges as a result of the whole steak knife affair. So around 1986 or 87, I secretly began writing a novel. I didn't tell anyone because, of course, I had very little confidence in myself and I didn't know whether I could do it. I suppose I was experimenting. But after about 2 years, I had a manuscript, which was which became my first novel, West Belfast, and I submitted it to Mercier Press in Dublin, Cork, and they published it. So the book West Belfast, my first novel, was published, believe it or not, over 30 years ago. It was published in December 1989. But before I had the opportunity to actually do a book launch or to do festivals or do readings, is how you sell a book around that literary circuit, I was arrested on the 7th of January 1990 and ended up sentenced to 8 years in jail. And it was whilst in the H blocks that I wrote my second novel, which was called...
Let me stay with the first novel.
Okay.
Let me stay with the first novel, because it is such a leap from privately preparing a book or privately structuring a book until that book is in the public domain. It's almost like, not quite, but it's almost like the birth of your first son or first daughter. This is something that your heart, soul, sleepless nights, all of that has been put into, and it's now there for people to hopefully appreciate, and of course, as we always have, some to ridicule. What can you even begin to describe that feeling?
Well, I remember I was living in Earls Court Street at the time, and when the book came out, Tom Hartley and Jim Gibney had been in Dublin, so they brought the first parcel of books up to the house, which I opened, and to hold it in my hand was quite extraordinary, because it's not like a newspaper or a magazine article or even a book review. It's a solid book, you know, it's 75, 80,000 words. It's organic, has a beginning, a middle, and end. There are characters in it, things happen to them, life crosses them, it's how they emerge out of that conflict. So I was very, very pleased. It was received well. Now, however, I was attacked by Fintan O'Toole in the Irish Times, who said that I was sexualising violence in the book. The London Independent gave it to Ruth Dudley Edwards to review, no friend of the Republican movement. So you had all of these people piling on top of you. Also at that time, in charge of radio drama in Belfast was Pam Brighton, who later went on to form the company Double Joint. So Pam Brighton recommended to BBC Radio 4 that it be turned into a book of the week or dramatised, and that died at death. Not only that, but later on, just to jump forward a little bit, in 1994 or 1995, when I was in jail, I was asked, I got a letter from the BBC asking me would I write a short story for them. So I wrote a short story. Stephen Ray recorded it. they signed the contract, and then it didn't appear in the Radio Times. So I got my lawyer onto it, and I then wrote to the BBC in London, and the head of the BBC in London sent me a letter, which the Guardian then did a story on. This guy turned around and said, "We will never broadcast anything by you." So I'd already been censored under Thatcher's Broadcasting Act. I'd been censored from TV and radio. I had already been banned from England, even though I was elected to the Assembly. Shortly after Gerry Adams, Martin McGuinness, and I were elected to the Assembly, the British government introduced exclusion orders against us. So if I had gone to England to speak in a public meeting, I would have been arrested and sentenced to 5 years in jail, which of course was the very thing that Thatcher was complaining about Russia with Andrei Sakharov, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, because the Russians excluded him from Moscow and said if he came into Moscow, he would be jailed. And she did exactly the same. And in my case, I'd lasted for 14 years. So the BBC wouldn't publish the short stories, and I was imprisoned. But that didn't deter me, and that's when in jail, I wrote my second novel.
But nevertheless, despite the censorship, despite the travel ban, despite all of that, you were a writer. As you say, you had an organic, living document called a book, and it was yours. And I remember at the time, it did attract a fair amount of attention from other writers around the world, people who were aware that you were in prison at the time, and people who had, through the grapevine or through friends, had begun to become aware of not only Donnie Morrison, the political activist, Donnie Morrison, the writer. Was that like a coming of age?
Well, I remember getting a letter, an anonymous letter from a Protestant woman, saying that she had read the book and that it helped her subsequently understand why the nationalist community, or a section of it, would move from being a very peaceful community towards supporting an armed struggle. And she says because the book, basically West Belfast, begins in 1863, and it covers the Divis Street riots. It covers the Malvern Street killings, and Peter Ward, who was from Beachmount, being killed in July 1866. It covers the civil rights movement and the attack on Duke Street. August 1969, Falls curfew, internment, and two of the characters who are brothers joining the IRA. One of them is a hooded man, and that section, which I think is a very strong part of the book, I interviewed about 4 or 5 hooded men. I then didn't write anything. I'd sit inside myself for about 3 or 4 months, and then wrote it spontaneously as one person went through. And that was a lot of writers said that found that very powerful. And also a scene where an IRA sniper takes the life of a British corporal, and that's written in a sort of a stream of consciousness where we have access to the thoughts of the IRA sniper throughout this whole tense 10 minutes. A lot of people praise that quality of the writing, because I was experimenting. I didn't know how to write. I didn't know, how to use time and what comes first, and how to use flashback, etc. You just start at the beginning and work your way through the narrative time to the very end, because that can be quite dull. By the time I got to my 4th or 5th book, I was quite confident about what I was doing. And for example, when I was writing the wrong Man, which is a book which is still selling, and actually in the last 2 years has taken off again, even though it was first published in 1997. It's about inside an IRA unit, claustrophobia of suspecting that one of the members is an informer. I remember when I was reading that book, or writing that book, I decided, right, okay, well, the book is going to start with the end of the book. And I just moved the entire end, and so that it acted as a prologue, so that we're in the middle of an interrogation, and it begs lots of questions. What's happening here? How did this person end up here? And then when I start the book proper with chapter 1 after the prologue, it builds up towards that climactic ending to the book. So there's, I mean, as soon as I get a thought, I have to write it down. That's why I like to
Are
have
your
pens and
books,
pencils and everything.
there is an old adage, says I, who have never written a book in my life, but there's an old adage that you should write about what you know about.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's what I'm told. I suspect it doesn't always work, and I suspect you can write badly if there is such a thing as a bad book, but you can write badly about anything. The second book that you began to mention was completely different kettle of fish
Yes.
from the West.
Oh yes.
So,
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, when I was in Crumlin Road Jail.
but let me just, before you go into that, did you deliberately change your focus, or did you deliberately change that kind of territory to do a second different book?
Well, the second book is about a young postman, 21, 22 years of age, who is gay. It is set in the Belfast of the 1990s, but the underlying assumption is that the troubles were resolved in 1921-22. So there's no RUC, there's no bombings or shootings, but there's still a very conservative society which is hostile and discriminates against gay people. So that's the type of repressive atmosphere that my main character is operating in. And he falls in love with a 15-year-old boy. So therefore it's illegal. So it's what happens to him as he tries to avoid being in love, and at the same time he becomes a victim of Victorian attitudes which are prevalent in society, and intolerance. So I decided to write that book as a challenge to myself, because it wasn't going to be about the IRA.
Yeah.
And I was writing it in prison, so therefore I didn't have immediate access to location and how to describe an area. I had to dig deep. Everything had to come from my memory banks. And where I got the idea was this: when we were under man in Crumlin Road Jail, if somebody, most of the prisoners on A wing or C wing, Republicans, were in for political offences. But if somebody was in, for example, for a riot, or something which is sort of quasi-political, if our numbers were down and we needed strength against the loyalists, if there was fights going on in the yard or on the wings on the way to visits, sometimes we would allow such people to come onto the wing. And the loyalists had a similar attitude. So, for example, there was this young lad who was charged with assaulting 3 RUC men from around Newton Ards or somewhere like that. So the lawyers let him on the wing, and he was walking around the wing with them for maybe a month, until they realised that whilst he was charged with assaulting 3 RUC men, it was when they came to arrest him to quiz him about having an affair with a 15-year-old boy. So they tortured him. I mean, they beat him black and blue. He was locked in the cell, and because he had been walking around the yard with them, he knew all the scandals of the loyalists, who had been unfaithful, who had squealed in the barracks, who had run away from jobs. And he would narrate out the door stories mimicking the voices of the lawyers, which we would be in stitches just laughing at this. The lawyers would be going crazy: "I'm going to kill you." And they're trying to pour boiling water over him. Eventually, it got so bad that he broke up the bulb in his cell and ate it, and was taken out, and we never saw him again. So that was the germ of the idea for my character, Nicky, that became On the Back of the Swallow.
The people who reluctantly shared that prison with you, and I mean reluctantly because they didn't want to be in prison, were they surprised at the subject matter? Was it something that they approved of? Was it something that they thought was a bit dangerous, a bit odd, a bit different?
Well, the loyalists gave me a lot of slagging. They were calling Queenie, oh, Queenie. to me. But when I had the book in draft and before I submitted to Mercury Press, I asked Bobby Story. We were on the same wing. He was a Red Book prisoner at the time, and he read the story. I wanted to get his reaction, and it was important to get support, not political support, just for somebody to turn around and say, "That's a good story." That's all I wanted to hear.
Yeah.
And he said that's a good story. So the book then came out, and this time, the Irish Times gives it to. There's a professor of history called Roy Foster, who's a revisionist, who would not be in any way sympathetic to Republicans. So they give it to his wife to review. I can't remember her first name, Aisling Foster. And of course, her review said, and remember, the premise of the book is that there's no troubles. Who does Danny Morrison think he is? Where are the hooded men, the bombs and the baseball bats? If he thinks he can write this story depicting Belfast in such a way, oh my God, it was just sheer, once again, I was being attacked ad hominem because of who I was, rather than the quality of the book. And this is a continual problem, trying to get people to read a book. And it'd be bad. For example, at one stage I contemplated putting Joe Watson on the cover of my books, any name, rather than mine, to see if it got a more worthy or less biased or an objective review. But I'm not going to do that, of course. But you can understand.
But of course, many readers have been forced to do that. Many readers have done that to test not only the quality of the reception, but indeed the quality of their writing, whether it's a name that carries a story or whether it's a merit. But we're really rapidly running out of time, and it's a fascinating discussion. And I want to jump you forward, if you don't mind. I want you to talk about, and I'm sure you remember vividly, the last release from prison. So the political situation has changed dramatically. You're, of course, proven innocent, but not at this stage. But you're out of prison. The war is over. Politics is moving on. Was the temptation to I know you've never lost an interest in politics, and you've always been an R, and you remain a political activist. But was there a temptation that you would go back into that, or focus, or was there maybe this kind of pulling and thrusting of what do you do at this stage?
Well, I was in jail when the ceasefire was called, and then I got out of prison, and I was going to report right back. Remember Jerry Adams saying to me, "You haven't seen your children for like 5.5 years. Take time off. Take a year off." And then that, I had been divorced in jail. In that year, I rented a house in Crocus Street. I was finishing. I had started The Wrong Man in jail, and I was finishing it on the outside. And I was offered, the Guardian asked me to do some book reviews for them. The Irish Examiner asked me to write political analysis for them. So I covered, for example, the Good Friday Agreement for the Guardian and the Irish Examiner. After that year, when Jerry came back to me and says, "Right now we're going to slot you in somewhere," and I said, and I felt really guilty about this, because people had gone back into jail again when that ceasefire broke down. My brother was in jail serving 25 years. But I knew I was middle-aged, grandfather. If I didn't do it, no, I was never going to do it. And so I said to Jerry, I totally support what's going on. I says, but I want to become a full-time writer. And he totally supported me. He says, "Good luck." I subsequently helped edit Sinn Féin's the paper that they put into Mitchell proposals. I edited it. I made several broadcasts, election broadcasts, designed them and edited them and developed them in like a professional studio. And of course, I'm secretary of the Bobby Sands Trust, and we've been involved in many projects. But I am obviously a Sinn Féin supporter, but a lot of my work still involves politics. For example, I've just finished editing a brilliant memoir, which will come out either later this year or next year, by a former blanket man called Jazz McCann, who was also on hunger strike for a short time, who escaped in 1983 and was caught, and who served 17 years in jail. And it's a great memoir, so I've edited that, which is a Republican project in a way. But I also review books and novels for various newspapers and magazines. I have had a play on in Edinburgh and London and Belfast. Half a play there, half a novel there. So I mean, I still have lots to do and lots of ideas, of course.
And I will, if you don't also mention that you were the chair of Scéalta and introduced scribes into rock, introduced live writers onto the Falls Road. A big step. It may not seem to be a big step, but for many working class people, writers are those people you've seen on television. They weren't the guy around or the woman around the corner down the street. You didn't have an opportunity to go to a local community event and listen to world class writers, people who were the best of their trades.
Brilliant writers, at Scribes. So Marion Keyes, Alexis Sale, Linton Kwesi Johnston, Michael Moore, Tim Robbins. I mean, dozens of them, and they all become ambassadors for Scéalta afterwards because they realise there's something special going on here. And of course, the origins of the festival in the conflict, and then after the ceasefire, almost as a movement for peaceful progress and reconciliation, and cross-border cross-community engagement was incredible. So they can see that. And I mean, a friend of mine who lives in Poland, who's a writer, he was speaking at Galway Festival last year, and a woman who had appeared at Scribes was sitting next to him. She turned around and says, have you ever been to Belfast? He says, oh yes, I know people in Belfast. He says, they invited me up there to do their festival. Fella, she says Fella, right? And she says, I have a brilliant time for 3 days. I had a brilliant time, and I've never been to the north before prior to that. So we have partition here. The damage that partition has caused has been immense, and thank God for the festival opening all doors, and for the work that you do as well, Joe, in tourism, hospitality, and inviting in people and showing and showcasing the immense talent and the whole chemistry that exists in West Belfast.
From the blanket, from the torch below the blanket, writing your diary as a young boy, you've now produced how many books?
4 novels, 3 non-fiction. Then I was the main editor of the Hunger Strike book. I've written several plays, short stories. Despite what the BBC said all those years ago, I have had my short stories broadcast on the BBC and on RTE, despite Section 31. So it's a small body of work in many ways in comparison to people who have been out there for some time. But that's okay. That's okay by me, as long as what I produce to me is valuable. As part of the coronavirus gestures that people are putting up, I made available one of my novels, Rudy, which is about a tramp and who lives in self-isolation. So I give 50 copies of it away the other day, just for the price of postage and packages, and within like 12 hours, 50 copies had gone out there. So I'd be glad. I mean, I don't need the money from them. I'm glad that people will have access to that piece of writing and maybe recommend it to some friends.
For those who, I think your body of work is dense in so far as that it's not trivial. It's thought provoking. It's certainly written with the passion, and it's written with a view and an analysis and an experience which is unique. So I don't think it's a light body of work. But for those who will listen to this broadcast and have that kind of secret temptation, which we all have, but that secret temptation to try and be a writer, to try and have something published. And as you said earlier on about your own experience, that initially lacked that courage, because it is a big step to put your soul and your heart out there for somebody to ridicule or to dismiss or whatever. What advice is, or I know you don't do advice, but just for this one occasion, what advice would you give to them?
Well, I think it's very important to read, and to read widely, and to read all generations. So that means reading books from the 1940s, 1930s, 1920s. And I mean, I can no longer read a novel innocently. As I read a book now, I'm looking for effects and tricks that the author might be using to create tension, or to create mystery, or to express romance and emotion. So it's very important people read widely. But the other thing about it is the practice. I mean, the practice of writing just means put down one sentence followed by another, and that's how you become a writer. The other thing is now there's not. For about 12 years I was involved in organising with Biffy, and then on another occasion with Fellows for Justice, creative writing classes. I held courses which lasted for about 8 to 10 weeks. I'm not so sure if there's so many of them around now, because of course arts funding cuts have just been immense and deep. So there's not much in the way of creative writing classes. But even people together, coming together as a group of readers, book clubs is another great idea. But it is, and it's one of the reasons why I'm able to probably cope with this isolation with a lot of other people. Writing is a solitary profession. You're on your own, making up stories, telling lies in order to try and bring about a truth about the meaning of life. And you have to do that on your own. I mean, I would work, for many, many hours at a time without talking to anyone. It's a big temptation there is check your email, check Twitter, because I've also turned out to be a bit of a Twitter addict as well. But I use Twitter. I read books on Twitter. I distribute publicity and propaganda through Twitter, both cultural propaganda and political propaganda.
For those people who have never had or never exercised the luxury of being absorbed, enchanted in a book, their heart and soul in the book, can't wait to turn the page, can't wait to get to bed the next night to read the second. Would there be, or is there one author that you say, this is a must, you must read this person's work? Is there one person?
That changes over time, so it does. Like, for example, for non-political book, there are two books that are quite powerful. In Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee by D. Brown, about what had happened to the Native Americans, is the story of the Palestinians in the 20th and 21st century. The other book, and it's never been out of print since 1985, which is 35 years, is 10 Men Dead by the South African journalist David Beresford, which is an astonishing account of what those men and their mothers and families went through in 1981. My own personal, I love Hermann Hesse, who is a German pacifist and a philosopher. And in fact, my fourth novel, Rudy, the one that I gave away the other day, is based on a novel that he wrote in 1915 called Knut, which is basically, it's a very simple story. It's about a young man, a promising scholar, who falls in love with a slightly older woman who breaks his heart. He can't cope. And that's what his life's about. And so that's what my book Rudy is about as well. I used the plot, borrowed the plot, moved it to Ireland. And it's a small novel, maybe about 60,000 words, 65,000 words, but I think it will stand the test of the time.
Danny, I have to tell you, as always in our discussions, we're out of time. I want to thank you for joining us and being our guest. We talked before the program about perhaps doing some other work around writing and reading paragraphs at book club with a variety of people, including yourself, of course. But that's for another day. But for those who have just joined us, or those who have joined us before the program, before the start of the program, my guest has been Danny Morrison. My name is Joe Austin. This is a Scéalta program. It's produced by Falcha Fierce here. Danny, Goramila Mayagat, and we'll see the other side of the pandemic. Thank you.
Okay. Take care. Stay safe.
Onward.
Onward.
Onward.